Dr. Thing, I contacted with Professor Zhu, and he used email to enter into the website, but have some problem for his Zoom system, maybe because his Zoom system is Chinese.
Okay.
So I asked him to submit a password or any other things. So some difficult for him to enter into now.
Okay. So we'll wait for him a bit more. But I think we can start the session already since the webinar has begun. So some of the guests are coming in already.
So we just wait for maybe meanwhile.
Yeah.
I'll try to get him to log in and see how. Okay.
Okay, sure, no problem.
Yeah. So
but first I'd like to welcome the guests as well. So to welcome everyone who's attending today to the roundtable discussion on the South China Sea issue and also the Indo-Pacific strategy. So this session will be discussing about the contemporary issue on the South China Seas and also about the present ongoing issue that has been going on for a long time. And today we are joining us today, actually, our special guest from the Global Governance Institute and also the Center for New Inclusive Asia, and together hosting with the International Movement for a Just World. I would like to welcome Professor Zhong Feiteng, Captain Andy Shin Tian, and also our moderators, Dr. Jin Kai and Koh King Kee, to the session as well. My name is Hassanal Noor Rashid. I am the program coordinator for the International Movement for a Just World. And on the Malaysian side, I would like to welcome Dr. Chandra Muzaffar and also Dr. Zakaria, Haji Ahmad. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I believe that I will pass the floor to the moderator for the first session, to Dr. Jin Kai, to give his introductory remarks and also to introduce the speakers and everyone else. So once again, thank you everyone, welcome. And also just on one note, last note, for the participants who would like to ask questions to our panelists and our speakers, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom taskbar itself to answer your question, to ask your questions over there, and the moderators and everyone else will pass it to the respective speakers to answer. Okay, so with that, Dr. Jin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Hassanal. Hello, everyone. My name is Jin Kai. I'm Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of Center for American Studies of Global Governance Institution. I'll be moderating the first session of today's event. So in the first half, each of the 6 speakers, right now we have 5 where we start waiting for Professor Zhu Feng to log in. So the 6 speakers will be giving a 5-minute speech on the South China Sea issue, and of course, including the US policies and actions in the region. Like what are the recent updates and what are the implications of Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy in the South China Sea issue, especially putting the background of so-called, US-China strategic competition. So Mr. Koh King Kee will be moderating the second session, and the 6 speakers will be talking and of course asking questions in a free discussion. So while we are waiting for Professor Zhu Feng to log in, shall we start the first session? Without waiting for Professor Zhu Feng, right? We can start now, I think. Right, so a brief introduction of each guest will be given before each speech, and the 6 scholars, 2 sides, I mean China and Malaysia, will be making cross presentations, so one by one. And without further ado, let's begin with Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Is that okay with you, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar?
Thank you very much.
Let me give you a brief introduction of you. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is Director of Programs for the International Movement for Just World, which is an international NGO based in Malaysia that seeks to critique global injustice and...
Dr. Jin Kai, let me interrupt a little bit.
Okay.
Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president, not the director.
Oh, okay.
It's important.
The president for the international movement. Sorry for the mistake. The president for the International Movement for Just World, which is the international NGO based in Malaysia. That seeks global injustice and develop an alternative vision of just and compassionate civilization, guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and also Malaysian society. So Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator, friends, peace be with you. I would like to begin by thanking the co-organizers of this event, and also all others who have made this possible. In this very brief 5-minute presentation, I shall try to make a few critical points. The obsession with China on the part of the United States of America has been fundamental to the sort of institutions, initiatives, and misfortunes that have overtaken this region in the last 15 to 20 years. If you look at institutions like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now a dead letter, the Quad, AUKUS, and a number of other initiatives, they all related to one basic goal: the desire, the determination of the United States of America to contain China, and I would even go further and say it's a determination to vanquish China. This is why all these institutions have come up, including what has been broadly described as the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, why is the United States of America obsessed with the rise of China, with defeating China? It's mainly because the United States of America sees itself as the ruler of the world and wants to remain as the ruler of the world, perpetuate its dominance, its hegemony. This is something which the leading American intellectual, Noam Chomsky, noted a few decades ago, that the overwhelming desire on the part of the United States of America is to perpetuate its hegemony, to remain the ruler of the world. And for some reason, the US feels that China is a threat to this, that China is a challenge to the US desire to perpetuate its dominance. Now, whether China is a threat or not is something that should be dealt with in a different forum. But let me say at this stage that if you look at it objectively, China is not really threatening the United States of America. China is concerned largely with its position as a middle-level nation state, developing, growing, still a very large percentage of its population living in poverty. China is very much aware of this. It wants to bring a certain degree of prosperity and happiness to its people. That's its driving mission. But the United States of America somehow feels that China, with its command of the global market, with its economic drive, its scientific and technological skills, is going to threaten the position of the United States of America. And as a result of this, we find that the US has undertaken various measures to ensure that China is vanquished. And this is what has given rise to tension and friction and a certain degree of conflict in this region. Friends, the challenge facing all of us is how to get out of this quandrum. The US convinced that China is a challenge and a threat to the United States, but as a result of that, a threat to the world, a threat to world peace, to global harmony. China determined to develop as any nation would be, and seeking ways and means of strengthening its position. How are we going to get out of this situation? I'm convinced that there is no easy solution to this. But it does not mean that there has to be a conflict, that there has to be a war. That is something that we can avert. What we can do, all of us, especially in ASEAN, is to strengthen our sovereignty, our independence. We should not get into the mess that is emerging. We should not take sides in a superficial and foolish manner.
Okay.
We should, at the same time, ensure that our own viability and our own sustainability is perpetuated for our own interests and the interests of the region and for the rest of the world. There are various ways of doing this: strengthening our own internal economies, strengthening regional cooperation, strengthening science and technology, establishing the avenues for peace, pursuing a culture which sustains peace. We can do all these things, which we need not go into detail at this stage. But I think this is what we can do. I feel that nations in this region, ASEAN in particular, have a very important role to play. 660 million people, some big nations, some small nations, but very important countries. We must work together to
Right.
develop our sovereignty and independence.
Wrapping up a little bit, so it's
Yeah, coming to my last point, Dr. Jin Kai, we should strengthen our independence, our sovereignty. We should work together. We should develop a collective ASEAN identity. It's very, very important, especially at this stage. We must not be drawn into this conflict, but at the same time, we should send a very clear message to everyone, and especially to the United States of America. Especially to the United States of America. And the message is that the countries in ASEAN don't want to be a stooge, play thing for any particular big power or superpower. We want to maintain our independence. But that would mean taking into consideration our own interests. Our interests are paramount. We have no reason, for instance, to turn against China. In the case of Malaysia and almost every other country in ASEAN. Malaysia in particular has had very good relations with China for a very, very long while. It is rooted in history. China has interacted with Malaysia and the Malay kingdoms in this region for at least 2,000 years, even before the coming of Islam to this region. And these are relations which are solid. They've traded with each other. They've looked after each other's security. They've strengthened each other's political position. They've helped each other in difficult times. So China is a friend.
yeah, I have
And
to,
let me conclude by saying that we know that China is our very dear neighbor, our very close neighbor. Geography matters. Geography trumps geopolitical interests. And geography means that we will continue to maintain our close ties with China. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. I think I'm very impressed with two keywords in your speech. First, you mentioned about obsession of the US with China. Yes, sometimes the US is just too obsessed with the so-called rise of China. And you also mentioned that the rule of law. It is actually not an international rule of law. It is actually, in my personal opinion, it's a US rule of law, rule-based order. I'm sorry. So without further ado, let me introduce our second speaker in the first session, Dr. Zhong Feiteng. Dr. Zhong Feiteng is the head of Department of Great Power Relations Studies of National Institute of International Studies. His main research interests include international political economy, the political economy of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's foreign policy, East Asia and the United States, and he has published a large number of books and articles in the above-mentioned fields. So, Dr. Zhong Feiteng, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Kachi. Dr. Kachi. I totally agree with your point about the liberal international order or rule of law is the U.S. law. Yeah. My overall opinion on the South China Sea issue is that the United States see the South China Sea as a major challenge to the liberal international order. So therefore, mobilize alliance to advance the freedom of navigation operation, shifting from unilateral action during the Trump administration to a more multilateral action. The logical of the above argument is that as follows. In the view of American decision makers, the concept of maritime order, economic and trade channels, and the order of the Indo-Pacific region are all centered around the South China Sea. Unlike the trade deficit between China and the United States or the Korea Peninsula nuclear issue, the South China Sea issue has a multi-level natures involve both maritime transportation and global trade, as well as the competition for regional dominance and old. The significant challenge or changes in the U.S. South China Sea policy is not only a product of the relative decline of U.S. power, but also reflects a deeper understanding of power transfer in different issue area. People recognize that power transfer is a relative long-term process, but there is less discussion about the time and the sequence required from rising power and established power to reprise their dominant position in different issue areas. Although the United States still leading military power, and China has owned much poverty, as President Chandra mentioned. So the power gap between United States and China is still very large, I think. But from the perspective of the United States, when they see around the world, only the China ranked behind the United States, the third or the fourth power, largely very far behind the U.S. So to my view, the power transformation information detected by the United States in China's South China Sea is diversity. China's overall strength and stature continues to rise, but the imagine and motivation in it presents to the outside world, where in different issue area. In this different issue area, the construction of islands and reefs in the South China Sea is widely believed to reflect China's strength and intention to become a regional hegemony. On China Sea, South China Sea issue, although China has not yet been able to reverse the dominant position of the U.S. Discourse on South China Sea, China's own discourse on South China Sea is increasing In the view of the United States, China's strengthened sovereignty and islands and reef construction in South China Sea highlights the Chinese government's unwillingness to abide by the recognized maritime oath by the United States, which has called the U.S. Conception and ideology of international maritime oath. In this set of maritime oath and philosopher, Americans are most concerned about freedom of navigation. What worries the United States more than the global power transfer between China and the U.S. is that its dominance in the West Pacific region is slowly losing. So the security balance in South China Sea region, the momentum of the rise of the Chinese Navy is very evident, I think. So according to the realism in the international relations, it is predicted that major powers that have a premonition of their own decline are more inclined to launch defensive wars and use a proactive attitude to suppress the enemy than those that are in the process of rising. However, if we take a look at the time cruise, if the change in the nature of the Sino-US relation occurred before the Trump administration, the South China Sea policy shift, it can be said that the former lead to the latter. If the two occur in parallel, the South China Sea issue is regarded as evidence of the change in the nature of Sino-US relation. It is difficult to see the impact of overall change in Sino-US relation on maritime issue. It is more likely that South China Sea issue has a certain degree of independence and then follows its own developmental logic, such as being widely regarded as a part of the liberal international order, just like Dr. Jin Kai mentioned the law-based international order. However, when we discuss the origins of this debate in the United States, some argues there's origins in its domestic political economy, such as the income gap between the elites and the middle or low class. Another way to debate this policy change is the international level. China's rise to accuse U.S. policy react in South China Sea. So I think the issue combined several levels, several issue areas the United States concerned, and I think it's a more dependent issue. It's not so closely related to Sino-US relation, but consists of the liberal, international liberal order concerned by the United States. That's my basic idea about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhong Feiteng. I think you made a very good point by utilizing the theoretical review of the current situation in South China Sea. For example, the power transformation, the power transition between, for example, China and the U.S., making the South China Sea issue a very good example to be examined, given this background. And you also point out very clearly the U.S. actually is obsessed and making those overreactions toward China's policies and actions. So thank you. I'm looking forward to your more discussion in the second session. So without further ado, let's move to the third speaker of today, Professor Dato Dr. Zakaria Haji Ahmad. He's a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the HELP University and CEO and the HELP Academy. Currently, Professor Zakaria is also the Distinguished Fellow of the Malaysian Armed Forces Defense College and the Malaysian Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations and the Institute of Public Security of Malaysia. Professor Zakaria serves as the board member of the Malaysian American Foundation from 2014 to 2017. So, Dr. Zakaria, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope everybody can hear me. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting seminar. I think the question on the table is really about the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and whether or not it can be a problem solver for the South China Sea issue that is presently something that worries quite a lot of people, especially the countries of Southeast Asia that have claims in the South China Sea. I want to move away from dealing with that. I personally feel that the Indo-Pacific strategy does not provide a means to solve the South China Sea problem. In fact, it may exacerbate the problem because the United States is interested to use this strategy, I think, as a means of containment of China. So while there are some positive elements in the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think it doesn't promise, the kind of solutions that we might think about. So I want to move into the area of what possibly can be, problem-solving alternatives to just looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think for the South China Sea and looking at the South Asian countries, it may be useful to think about the neutralization of the South China Sea itself. Several decades ago, we had from Malaysia a proposal for the neutralization of Southeast Asia. Basically, it is to prevent the intervention of external powers in the Southeast Asian region. I think for the South China Sea, I think it is probably an opportune time for us to think again about this issue of the neutralization of Southeast Asia and whether that is possible. So far, there's nothing being proposed. But if we neutralize the South China Sea, this may dampen the situation in terms of the clashes we have seen recently, especially between China and the Philippines. Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who has been Prime Minister of Malaysia at least 2 times, has made the proposal several years ago about the shall we say, not allowing warships in the South China Sea. This is the Mahathir doctrine, which I think the proposal basically was trying to again dampen the situation, because when we have warships in the South China Sea, this can be provocative and also may lead to unwarranted situations. But this proposal has not been taken. Neither the neutralization, because I have not seen that coming out from ASEAN or from the other Southeast Asian countries. So that is not possible. But I think it's something that we must put on the table. The other idea that I have, I think, about the South China Sea is whether or not there's a proposal that has been put forward by several organizations, and this is about joint development of the South China Sea. This means that all the claimants of the South China Sea will be able to engage themselves in the kind of joint development programs that will benefit all the countries of the South China Sea littoral. This is a promising idea. It may follow the joint development scheme that we have between Malaysia and Thailand, and this will benefit all the countries of the littoral of South China Sea. This is something that we should pursue. But the major problem of that proposal is about the issue of sovereignty. If it's joint development in terms of mutual benefit, I think there is no issue. But if it's a question that when you have the development, there is still a problem of sovereignty, then we do have a major challenge. And that major challenge comes out because of the fact that China, through its 9-dash line configuration of the South China Sea, basically means that they want to pursue the goal of having South China Sea as sovereign Chinese territory. This is difficult to accept from the other claimants of the South China Sea. So the joint development cannot take place as long as this idea of sovereignty remains. So we do have to think about how we deal with this particular problem. Even the idea of the South China Sea being called the South China Sea might be something that we want to think about. There's been some ideas that have been floated to push the name of calling it the Nusantara Sea. And because when you say South China Sea, then they suggest that somehow or other that sea belongs to China. So that might be an idea that we can think about. But this idea that I just put on the table is something, but I don't know whether it can be accepted, especially by China. Now, this also raises the issue about the peaceful resolution of the claims that the South China Sea. We have something called the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea. It's on the table. It's been discussed. It's being deliberated. We still have not seen the final copy of the Code of Conduct. This suggests obviously the differences that do exist among the countries of South China Sea. The Code of Conduct must be agreed upon by all the countries of the South China Sea, including China. So that means that we don't see it, it's not on the horizon yet. So that's another idea that I think we can push forward in terms of the resolution. In looking at Southeast Asia and then looking at South China Sea, there has been a proposal earlier on by a very distinguished scholar in which he suggests for the conflict management mechanism that can exist for not only Southeast Asia, but also I think, can extend to the South China Sea. And this is a mechanism in which we can deal with what he calls the extramural versus the intramural management of conflict that we have in the South China Sea. So this conflict management system, I think, is a good proposal. I think when you look at ASEAN and Southeast Asia, in the past, Southeast Asia's problems were basically because of the fact that we were able to have intramural and extramural management of the differences that exist in Southeast Asia. And so this is something that we can think about for the South China Sea. It has to be done by a neutral body in terms of that mechanism. And so this will warrant perhaps the involvement of the other actors who have interest in the South China Sea. This is not an ideal proposal. It's a proposal that I think can be done if we put our minds to it. And so this is something that we have to do. Now, this goes back to the question of China and the United States in the South China Sea. The problem of China is because of its 9-dash line, or some people say it's 11-dash line, and the sovereignty of the region of South China Sea. As long as this persists, I think we will continue to have the challenge of having to deal with the kind of problems that we already exist. We see problems between the Philippines and China. Earlier, we've seen the problems of Vietnam and China. And of course, the South China Sea, it's the region that we're looking at is very vast. It's both the Spratleys and the Paracels. And so it requires the kind of magnitude in terms of looking at this problem so that we can look at it as a whole and then try to figure out how we can neutralize the situation. On the issue of the region of South China Sea, there is a problem because if it belongs to China, then it is not possible for the free passage of vessels of other countries, including that of Southeast Asia. And that's why I think the Americans have pushed forward for the freedom of navigation of the South China Sea, which, of course, incurs the disagreement of China, I think, in this regard. So this is something that we need to look at. Finally, I think the question of ASEAN. I think ASEAN is useless in the South China Sea disputes. They have not been able to come out with any resolution which tends to indicate that there's a solution and there's unanimity of agreement between all the claimants of the South China Sea. And of course, one of the problems that we do have is that in ASEAN itself, it is an organization divided between the countries of continental Southeast Asia and that of maritime Southeast Asia. The South China Sea is a maritime problem, but it requires the unanimous agreement of both continental and maritime Southeast Asia. So I don't see ASEAN as playing a key role here. So it goes back again to whether or not we can have the overarching, perhaps extra-regional perspective of dealing with the South China Sea and putting perhaps for an international mechanism in which we can have this question of the management of disputes in the South China Sea. We can talk about the other issues of the Indo-Pacific Strait later, but I just wanted to focus basically on what the real problems of the South China Sea are before we move back to the Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your speech. I think I'm pretty impressed with 3 arguments you already made. The first, for example, you mentioned about how the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy does not provide any means to solve the South China Sea issue, and you made that very clear. The second point you mentioned about the neutralization of the South China Sea issue, and I think this is very interesting. So how to neutralize this issue? It's an issue between China and the Southeast Asian claimants, not the U.S. The U.S. is outside this region. And the third point you mentioned, very interesting. You said ASEAN is useless. I think maybe we can hear more about your explanation, maybe from some other speakers about ASEAN being useless in this issue and in resolving this issue. So let's move to our next speaker, Captain Andy Tian Chen. He's a retired captain of PRA Navy, and he's founder and president of Global Governance Institution and the director of Center for International Law of Military Operation of GGI, which Global Governance Institution. So as a professional with extensive experiences in China's military and foreign policies, he has involved previously and currently in many professional and academic communications and exchanges between China and many other countries. So, Captain Tian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was preparing for this presentation, I just submitted my PhD dissertation yesterday. The topic is the freedom of navigation in international law, a concept, history, and the state practice. But I will not repeat those contents of my PhD dissertation. So I would like to start by echoing one of the good points just mentioned by Professor Dato, Dr. Zakaria, and also clarifying one point. The good point is the joint development resolution of the South China Sea. I think since the very beginning, with our late Chairman, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, we have raised this idea of put aside the sovereignty issue and to jointly develop South China Sea. I think this is the idea from the very beginning of our policy. And second, I would like to clarify one point you mentioned about the non-dash line of South China Sea or dotted line. I think, as you mentioned that China claims the whole sovereignty within the non-dash line. I think that is the propaganda of the Western media. So almost all the Western media, they would say that China claims sovereignty within all the non-dash line, but actually there has never ever been any official position with regarding to this point. The Chinese government has never ever claimed the whole area within the non-dotted line as sovereignty. So the exact position of the Chinese government with regard to the non-dash line is, I think, the latest position is proclaimed on the 12th July of 2016, after the delivery of the South China Sea arbitration award. Only 4 points. I think the exact meaning of the non-dash line or dotted line, there are 4 meanings. First, we claim sovereignty over various Nanhai archipelagos, including Dongsha Qundao, Xisha Qundao, Zhongsha Qundao, and Nansha Qundao. This is the first point. And the second point, we claim that based on the rules of international law, we claim internal waters, territorial sea, and adjacent areas based on international law. That's the second meaning. Second, we proclaim to have EZ, economics and exclusive economic zones and the continental shelf. And the final point, the fourth point, we claim historical rights. So those 4 bulletin points, which is published on the official website of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is the exact Chinese official lines with regard to the meaning of 9-dash line. So I would like to refer to everybody to check the official website of the Chinese government to see what exactly we mean with regard to the position of the 9-dash line. So it's not like what the Western media have tried to produce as a result of the disinformation campaign. So I would like to start by these 2 points, and then given my background as the international lawyer, so I would like to touch upon very briefly 2 points about South China issue against the background of the Sino-US strategic competition. Although, as I always said, this strategic competition, we do not ask for it. It's imposed upon China. So only 2 points. First, the legal disputes involved. Second, the U.S.-Philippine military cooperation and its impact on South China Sea issue. As for the legal dispute involved, I think many of our previous speakers have touched upon it. First is the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And second is the South China Sea arbitration, which I will leave to the second session. As for the free, and as well, I think one of the thorny issue is the interstate passage of worship. I think I will say a few words first about the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. I think since begin with the 1977, the U.S. Put forward the freedom of navigation program. Actually, I think because the U.S. is not a claimant in the South China Sea, so the freedom of navigation is actually its only pretext or basis to intervene in the South China Sea issue. And it also, I think the U.S. is trying to use the South China, the freedom of navigation as an umbrella to cover all the military activities in the South China Sea, including the military survey activities, including the reconnaissance activities. He put all those activities under the umbrella of the freedom of navigation. And I think it's also an agenda setting for pushing the Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, I think it is also part of a disinformation campaign against China, because there is a kind of a truth versus lie. I think the freedom of navigation became a highlight issue. It begins with the October including of the destroyed license in 2015. Actually, if you look at the facts and figures in the South China Sea, the insurance rates has never raised. But at that time, because of the Western media propaganda, many countries in the world think that China is impeding the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. But actually, I think there is a trick here, because the United States, they intentionally mix together the warship with the merchant ships. Actually, as for the merchant ship, there is no problem with the freedom of navigation. But with the warship, the point is the United States is not conducting the normal operations in regard with regard to the freedom of navigation. They just circumvent the normal transportation line to intrude into the territorial sea or adjacent areas of Chinese territory. I think that's the problem. And final point, I would like to say a few words about the U.S. Philippine military cooperation. As for this point, I think the key issue is, could the self-defense article in the military defense treaty be used to cover the Philippine military provocations in the South China Sea? I think that is the key issue. First point, I'd like to say that, does the article apply in the area of Renaijiao, I mean, Second Tomat Shoal? Because if you look at the Constitution of the Philippines, the Renaijiao, the Second Tomat Shoal, is not within the limits of the Philippine territory. So how could this treaty apply to this area? Second point, I think the Philippine provocation only invites law enforcement actions instead of armed attack. So if you read in the article, it says that there will be an obligation from the United States to defend the Philippines in terms of armed attacks against Philippines. But I think in this case, in the South China Sea, in the Renaijiao case, it's not an armed attack. It's a law enforcement. And finally, could the U.S. proactively apply this treaty, this mutual defense treaty, to the Philippine military incursion in the Renaijiao area? I think for this case, there is a balance between U.S. cognizance obligation and mutual treaty obligation. The prohibition against the use of force in international relations is a U.S. cognizance obligation. It prevails over the defense obligations under the mutual treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines. So I think the U.S. cannot proactively apply or abuse the articles of the mutual defense treaty to military intervene in such situations. If the United States did use this article to military intervene, then the China will act in self-defense, also based on our rights under Article 2.4 of the United Nations. So with that, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you, King.
Thank you so much, Captain Tian. First, congratulations on your success for our PhD defense. Well, two quick comments. I think you made it very clear that about the rear position, the rear stance of Chinese government's 9-dash line. It's not like the people outside the circle saying China is including everything inside this dash line. So you made that very clear. And second, you mentioned also about the difference between an armed attack and law enforcement. I think this is very important. So I'm looking forward to more in-depth discussion in our second session. So now we move to our next speaker. Mr. Hassanal Noor Rashid is a project coordinator at the International Movement for a Just World. He has worked with professionals from various cultural, social, and academic backgrounds, many of whom have shared interest in peace, sustainability, especially in the contemporary geopolitical environment. So Mr. Hassanal, the floor is yours.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Jin Kai, for your excellent moderation so far, and thank you to every one of the speakers for sharing their insights. I don't really have too much to add on to what's already been said, especially from Dr. Chandra and Dr. Zakaria, especially touching on the topics of the ASEAN perspective, especially with regards to China's position in the South China Sea itself. Well, I'll just reiterate a few points and maybe add some things as an observation of sorts to what everyone else said, especially Professor Zhong Feiteng and Captain Andy Jin Tian. Partly, I want to reiterate a few things. I know a lot of analysts and academics who have been looking into the issue, especially in the popular online sphere, has looked at trying to logically ascertain the reason for why there's such a deep deep-seated conflict, I suppose, or deep-seated issue going on in the South China Sea. And as everyone know in ad nauseum at this point, on the point of how much trade goes through the South China Sea itself, about what $3 trillion US dollars of trade goes through the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, and so forth. And repeating again on that point, they talked a lot about things like the oceans and the fisheries and things like that. So there's a lot of natural resources to be, at stake when it comes to the South China Sea issue. So territorial disputes, border disputes are part of a very natural thing on that. But in regards to the entire geopolitical relationship, I'll just reason what Dr. Chandra said. While policies and politics are forever changing in the landscape, you cannot change geography. China in itself is one of the largest trading partners in Southeast Asia simply because of proximity alone. But also I want to hone in on the fact also that ASEAN in its conglomeration of different states as well as cultural groups, a lot of it can be traced towards China as well. And China does make up a significant portion of Southeast Asian history, cultural influence like way back when, especially during the establishment of the Malaccan Empire. And I think a lot of this is recognized by the people of ASEAN and also to a very large extent of the people of China as well. And on that note, I wanted to also highlight on that narrative aspect, because I think while a lot of efforts was made by the US to essentially, during the Obama administration, if I recall correctly, that they would try to back several ASEAN countries during the various points of disagreements within the in the ocean front where a lot of the disputes were happening. A lot of things have been said, there is an understanding of the US commitment in the region. It has no claim on historical sovereignty. It has no claims on historical rights. But the question of then, why is the US here? Why is the US actually, interfering in the affairs over there, freedom of navigation on the seas and all that? And often than not, it's because there's an underappreciated belief that national security and global security is best served by maintaining stability in ASEAN as well. And stability is the key functioning word here, especially when it comes to asserting diplomacy in relations to ASEAN. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the narratives from the US side has an agenda behind it. Their main agenda, of course, is the containment of China. But I would like to also maybe highlight on that one note where they have moved on the Obama administration, they had moved away from tactical maneuverings to containment of China towards more strategical, which is why you see increased troops being stationed over in Australia, for example, or attempts to increase relations and also, weapons imports and things like that into the Philippines as well. And a lot of these things have to do with an attempt to empower and also to help essentially form a bloc of sorts to contain China in itself. But for me, this entire thing also relies on a lot of the narratives that is being backed towards the historical claims on the island and the seas. And a lot of it tends to be that the narrative of the issue as well has a lot more power and precedence over this entire topic, more so than just the claims in itself, because ASEAN, let's see, the animosity is not really about the sides of ASEAN wishes to take. It's about, from what I've gathered, a lot of what the people of Southeast Asia are feeling towards about how they cannot sail in their own waters. And they view that the Chinese Coast Guards and all the other things over there are actually antithesis towards this. And therefore, that's where the animosity gets fostered and, the fires get stoked, especially. I have with me also a book from, what's his name? Gregory B. Poling, who takes great pains to actually document a lot of the incidences of the tensions and things like that that happened during the South China Sea issue. And in that, you can see where the narrative is being formed. The narrative is being formed about trying to paint a particular picture about China itself and China being distrustful and all that sort of thing. And it became a war of narratives once you start reading a lot of analysts who are trying to do that. And it becomes a lot of things. But then you feel ASEAN gets sort of like, sort of lost in the entire conversation on this one as well. So to summarize my point, and ultimately just to drive on this one little thing, ASEAN, I agree with Dr. Zach. I personally believe that ASEAN in itself is actually in a collective, a significant global power. But like Dr. Zach said, it just can't seem to get its act together. And it cannot seem to agree on an agenda, which is why when the US attempted to back Hanoi and Manila back in I think during the crisis in 2016, if I recall correctly, there wasn't much major footing, especially with a lot of what they can do. So in itself, it became sort of like the counterbalancing power for when the US attempted to push forward its own agendas and try to get the two across over there. Because ASEAN itself is that collective. However, at the end of the day, what is more important is that ASEAN needs, I feel, even though it cannot get its act together, it needs to be a key player, especially when it comes to stability in the region, especially as a counterbalancing power, because if anything happens in ASEAN, it definitely will have larger geopolitical ramifications across the board. So ASEAN cannot be part and parcel of that, but at the same time, I agree as well, a joint development effort, something to talk about ASEAN and its its place within global security in the region is a very important thing, and I think that needs to be invested in. So, like Dr. Andy also said, it's all about the narrative at the end of the day, and there's a lot of narratives that are going on around the place right now about China's position on the matter, and also on the US's attempt to try and frame and paint a picture of the issue to try and stoke certain antagonistic narratives. So ultimately, I would say that, and I'll use a Chinese idiom that I liked before. Forgive me as well to the audience and to the speakers if I butcher the language, but I think it goes as 耳听为属，眼见为实. What you hear may not be true, but what you see is true. And what the people of ASEAN and Southeast Asia right now must see is that it needs to see a collective effort from not just ASEAN, but from China itself, that it can trust China, it can trust the powers in the region to be able to make an effort in order to retain sovereignty, to maintain dignity, and to essentially build a block of trust, essentially. Because right now, I feel that there is a trust deficit of sorts when it comes to China, especially with the way that the narrative in the region is. And I think that is a shame because of the relationships that Southeast Asia and Malaysia as well that has with China. So on that, I'll end my note on that point, and look forward to our discussion in the second session. Dr. Jin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hasanel. Thank you for your very informative speech. Well, I think just one quick comment. You made it very clear that ASEAN as a collective body, and it cannot act together as a whole. So it could have some side effects in resolving the South China Sea issue, especially when there is a so-called strategic competition between China and the States in the region. So this is a very interesting point. Thank you. Now we move to our last speaker, Professor Zhu Feng. Are you online?
Yes.
Okay. So good to see you again, Professor Zhu Feng. Let me give you a brief introduction of you. Dr. Zhu Feng is an Executive Director of China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea at Nanjing University. He's also Director of the Institute of International Studies at Nanjing University. As a leading Chinese security expert, he writes extensively on regional security in East Asia, the nuclear issue in North Korea, China-US military and diplomatic relations. So, Professor Zhu Feng, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jin Kai. So it's a great pleasure to join this distinguished panel for our very, very constructive and enlightening discussion. So I enjoyed previous, presentations by our distinguished panelists. So I have just a couple of the points to add. I hope my presentation will just goes very, very briefly. first of all, I see the South China Sea's some sort of growing and escalating tension is with a consequential result of the Americans' increased, geostrategic containment policy vis-a-vis China. We also know what's the Americans' Indo-Pacific strategy. It's not just mean Americans withdraw from the Middle East and Europe and refocusing on the Western Pacific as the Americans' global security gravity. So with some sort of such a very dramatic shift, American puts its, the first priority of the great powers in a competition of confrontation very, very overwhelmingly and significantly on China. So currently, tension in South China Sea is just one of the new episodes, Americans' China policy. I mean, the U.S. just trying to tighten up the China's, maritime access, and also want to fending off the China's maritime extension by claiming the South China Sea's, rockets and the maritime, the domains. So behind some sort of such a second Thomas show, growing tension, I think, yes, it's also some sort of American factor. It's not just a creeping up on, it's also very, very most formidable factor behind such a tension. Of course, Manila just trying to riding on the Americans, the horse, and also use that just trying to loading back the Beijing's, the sovereign claim of the South China Sea. But the problem is, I think it's some sort of, we say, it's not just a great powerful proxy war yet, but it's just a great proxy, some sort of a diplomatic battle. So I really feel very worried. If all such as, the competition or even some sort of encountering on the sea will be, unfortunately, just falling into some sort of direct exchange of fire, then we will see the entire region probably also will be growing not just increasingly creepy, but it will be very, very diplomatically and militarily very disastrous. So then disintegration also will leading back some sort of a new Cold War, will be cross the line and become some sort of a new, reality in the East Asia. So that's why the South China's issue is a very timely reminder to us. As long as the U.S. will not just soften its China's, containing policy, such as geostrategic, the competition will be just a going move up rather than could just easing down. So then I see, yes, South China Sea issue has much far beyond the territorial or maritime, the interest, disputes. It's also become a leading, battlefield for the new Cold Wars in 21st century. The second, then we will see, yes, our Malaysian counterparts also just contribute very constructively on how we could just look at this tension and how we can just also move very productively, cutting off some sort of such a growing tension. But the key for now is really hope the ASEAN centrality could just standing out and work on some sort of new, constructive, engagement. Philippines is not just the ASEAN country alone. Berlin is also a very, very important part of the ASEAN platform. So I hope the ASEAN also could just play some sort of a role of mediating between Manila and Beijing. Don't just got into some sort of such an endless bet among the great powers on their some sort of maritime interest-centered competition. Otherwise, I also will see only just the US and China. It's harder to get some sort of attention, just the ease down. So what's the ASEAN's, the constructive, engagement? That's also what I'm looking forward to. Another point I want to make is this. Yes, South China Sea's disputes remain largely, we say, unresolved. But against the backdrop of the, we say, Philippines International Tribunal, it's harder for China to show the flexibility because this tribunal almost, completely deny the China's claim. So there's no way China could just, showing the global flexibility without some sort of such a rebalance, examination of how the disputes could be very rightfully and also, we say, productively addressed. So from this point, our Malaysian counterparts, your worry is totally understood. But on the other hand, I think as my colleague, Chinese colleague, made a couple points, China's claim is not just the historical right base, but is also some sort of a reality. So no one can just, keep the eyes very closed on some sort of China's righteousness in the, we say, sovereignty and the maritime domain claim. So then what kind of some sort of new methodology we can work on? Boosting the China and claimant state to showing some sort of more, the resilience and smartness in the smart solution of all such a disputes. It's not a test before us, but it's also a test on how the East Asia could just present some sort of a strategic, visionary idea. Then we are all equally just committed to get a region well, reserved, peace, sustainable prosperity, and even some sort of endurable cooperation. So that's why I really hope our panel discussion could also become some sort of a new boost to the urgency of our, such an open-minded, search for some sort of new approach and a new exit. As long as the China and the ASEAN could still sticking together, I see there's no way some sort of a great power competition will eventually just the risk of what? Risk of terminating the East Asia's peace and a sustainable development. Last point I want to say is this. For China, we should also show in some sort of diplomatic and strategic resilience, rather than just moving into the new Cold War, stimulation from the US, because they're totally against the China's interest. China also should just move very, very mindfully and constructively if some sort of such a conflict that just still, extending between with Manila. So then Beijing's some sort of visionary handling of the dispute issues, and also some sort of with the expectable persistence in some sort of a peaceful handling of all the things is not a big addition to the China's regional credibility. Is also a very, we say, indispensable resources for China and ASEAN can still just sitting together and working together. So from this point, I really hope that Beijing also could showing some sort of a growing strategic wisdom and resilience handling issue with our ASEAN countries. The Beijing also could just, move in some sort of very encouraging manner. But the problem is it's not easy. The reason is solving issue is always too much political and domestically very irritating. So then for the moment, I see the Beijing also has some sort of little credential. We can just, become more flexible. So all such domestic politics restraint, some sort of handling of the sovereignty disputes should be equally understandable on all the countries. But anyway, we also need just to get things well managed. Second, Thomas Zhou issue, there's no way I think Beijing and Manila could just resolve it very quickly. But the problem is, as long as we can just know how restrained we are, rather than just play the file, the things also will be getting better over the time. So then, my last words, the biggest concern for most of Chinese scholars is how ASEAN centrality could re-shining again. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for Professor Zhu Feng. I think you made many important and refreshing points. For example, you mentioned about a dramatic shift in geopolitical across the region. With this, I think this is making this clear that the so-called stability and freedom navigation by the US is actually a pretext in the region. And you also made some very interesting, refreshing suggestions for both sides. We hope you could elaborate a little more in our second session. So I think we are coming to the second session. So Mr. Koh King Kee, will be moderating this session. Let me just give a brief introduction of Mr. Koh. He's the founder and the president of East-West Bridge. And he's also president of Center for New Asia. He's adjunct professor of Taylor's University and chairman of China ASEAN think tank cooperation partnership. Mr. Koh has long been a keen observer of the political and economic developments in China, and he has been widely interviewed by Chinese and Malaysian media on China and China issues. So, Mr. Koh, the floor is yours. Hello,
Yeah, sorry, I'm unmute first. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Shin, for moderating the first session, and all the speakers for sharing your views from your perspective. About ASEAN, as Professor Zakaria said, it's a diverse group. Though we maintain and we keep emphasizing that we want to we don't know what to choose side in this China-US strategic competition, and we would like to be the driver. We want to be the driver in driving the narrative of ASEAN on issues relating to ASEAN. But however, I think we have not been very effective. Now, I just want to highlight one point talking about neutrality mentioned by Professor Zakaria. Way back in 1971, actually, all the ASEAN countries has proposed this ZOPAN, zone of free. What is it? ZOPAN, a zone of free
peace, freedom, and neutrality.
Yeah, freedom and neutrality. That's way back in 1971. And all the ASEAN countries are signatory to this, including China as well. China and US also they just signed. But how to uphold this? I think a lot of countries have forgotten this over this period. So it's interesting. I think we should revive this issue more actively, more proactively. And the other thing that I think we should agree, and the Chinese speakers have pointed out, is the South China Sea is not the inland lake or not the domestic sea of China. China have repeatedly mentioned this. It's a historical fact. The name is just a historical fact, just like Indian Ocean doesn't belong to Indian. So South China Sea, geographically is south of China. So well, to change the name can trigger some sensitivity geopolitically. So that I think we should bear in mind. What else? Now, that's all I have to highlight before we continue with the next session. Now, the next session will be more informal. So there will be no fixed sequence on who to speak first. And you are free to speak whatever thing you want and refute you disagree on the on other speakers' view. But try to limit it to five minutes. And if possible, I like to, you can speak more than one time. So that is okay. So maybe for a start, I'd like to invite maybe Captain Tian. Maybe you have something to say, to comment on the speaker's views.
Thank you, Kiki. I think I have sent the linkage of the official lines of the Chinese government regarding South China Sea in our chat box. I would like to refer all the speakers to those websites. And as well, I would like to respond to one of the questions raised by Dr. Tay Yap Long regarding, let me repeat his question. Thanks for allowing me to join this webinar. My question is, the tension between Philippines and China in the South China Sea is increasingly lately with the use of water curtain extra. Can both countries deal with the issue on a roundtable, face-to-face discussion? How it can be done in a more diplomatic way? In my understanding, I think my colleague can add some point to my. In my understanding, I think there have been many rounds of diplomatic communications between the two parties. The point is, the Philippines just do not listen anymore. They just take actions. I think the diplomatic communication has been conducted for many rounds. So that's my quick answer.
Yeah,
the floor back to you.
Yes, also I'd like to highlight that Malaysian Prime Minister has repeated many times the South China Sea dispute should not be contentious. It's just one of the issues, one of the relationship between ASEAN or the ASEAN country with China. There are broader issues, there are economic, political, things like that. And actually, China's dispute with the ASEAN claimants over some of the islands or atolls in South China Sea, it's actually a bilateral issue. However, it was the involvement of US, that complicate and internationalize it. Way back in 2011, actually, US took a neutral stand. It doesn't side anyone in the South China Sea dispute. It was after Obama 2011 that after this so-called rebalance pivot Asia that start getting involved, and of course getting deeper and deeper involvement in South China Sea, and it has now, as Professor Zhu Feng has said, it become the battlefield of China US strategic competition of rivalry. It has become the most important battleground now. Actually, some analysts feel that the Indo-Pacific strategy actually was tailored or designed to contain and constrain China. So this is why, today's topic is and the theme of discussion is South China Sea and specific and this Indo-Pacific strategy. So we should focus, we should try to focus our discussion based on this theme. So with that, maybe from the Malaysian side, Dr. Chandra, you have anything to say or to comment? Dr. Chandra, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Koh King Kee. I would also like to begin by commending all the speakers for the presentations, the moderator for his moderation. Some very interesting ideas have been generated through this discussion, and I hope these ideas would be discussed in greater depth, not just in a forum like this, but also through other avenues in the future. It should be a part and parcel of a continuous discussion of a serious endeavor to try to understand issues which are bound to haunt us for a very, very long while, for decades to come. Let me just touch on 2 points which have been raised in this discussion. Number one, the code of conduct. I think the code of conduct is something which is important to all the ASEAN states and to China, and perhaps even to the US. It is a pity that it has been bogged down over the years, numerous attempts, various rounds of discussions, and at certain points in time, the participants had felt that it was futile, that it was not generating much light. I would like to think that the code of conduct is worth pursuing. There are difficulties. For instance, a lot of ASEAN countries are under the impression that China's concept of the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, that concept is a hindrance in evolving, in forging a code of conduct. But if I listen again and try to reflect upon what has been discussed today, I think there is some serious misunderstanding. If official Chinese opinion, if the official formal Chinese position on the South China Sea doesn't embrace the notion of sovereignty that tramples upon the rights of all the other states, I repeat, if their concept of sovereignty does not trample upon the rights of all the other states, then I think one can pursue the code of conduct as an idea, as a solution to some of the challenges that we face. I, for instance, was under the impression that the Chinese notion of the South China Sea covered something like 85% of the South China Sea, as articulated in various circles, both governmental circles and in the media. If it's 85%, and if it infringes upon all the other states, including Malaysia, for instance, which has been very accommodative, then it becomes difficult for us to develop a common code of conduct. But if, on the other hand, it is not what it has been projected so far, that it's 85% of the whole of the South China Sea, that it infringes upon the territorial integrity, the territorial waters of the different states. If it doesn't, then I think one can regard the discussions on the code of conduct as something that would be able to produce some results, if that isn't an obstacle. So that's something which I think needs clarification. It's a pity it has not been clarified. I wonder why governments in the region have not really sought to clarify this, where China and the ASEAN governments, who meet so regularly for all sorts of meetings, why haven't they taken the this opportunity to clarify this, that this is exactly what the South China Sea means to them, that it doesn't infringe on the territorial rights of the others, that we can still talk about it as a basis for working together. And that leads us to the second point, which is if we can work together using the Gulf of Thailand, the Gulf of Siam sort of model, Malaysia and Thailand from 1979, we can use that as a model, sharing resources, cooperating. In the case of Thailand and Malaysia, it's cooperation over oil, fisheries, and all the rest of it. If we cannot approach the South China Sea from that perspective, that all of us can discuss this issue together in an open-hearted manner and try to come up with some solution.
Okay.
We don't have any big obstacles. So this is the point that I want to make. Maybe we should try to do something about civil society groups.
Yeah.
Because those of us are here, we're all linked to different civil society groups. Maybe we should ask for a more enlightened discourse on the South China Sea. Clear the misconceptions. Let me finish, please. Clear the misconceptions. And after we've cleared the misconceptions, then we can go on to the second stage, which is to see how we can formalize a code of conduct. I think the formalization of a code of conduct is very, very important. Only then can we talk about working together, sharing resources, building up common areas of conduct and cooperation and all the rest of it. But the most important thing is we have to develop a code of conduct. And to do that, the misconception of the South China Sea, if there is a misconception, should be clarified.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Yeah. Professor Zhu Feng, would you mind you clarify a little bit? I think there's a bit of confusion saying that China claimed the entire South China Sea, 90% of the entire water. And and then there's also confusion over this EEZ extended economic zone and the sovereign waters. And also the historical facts of this. You are expert on this, Professor Zhu Feng.
Yes. Yeah. My view, I don't think China's claim of the 9-line fringe area is completely exclusive. Is completely dominant some sort of all shower rocks and even just the maritime areas. I think if you just very carefully examine China's claim, then we will see as Captain Tian also mentioned. So China just claims some sort of a couple of we say such a island groups. It's very important. Then second, the Beijing also consider we have a historical right based some sort of such a Chinese maritime entitlement in the 11 or 9 dash line friend area. It's fishing, it's resources exploration, and it's some sort of navigation. But the problem is there's still some sort of ambiguity. For example, it's completely inclusive. It's all absolutely exclusive. As I mentioned, I still see some sort of room to dig in. Now, on the other hand, then we'll all see, for example, the China's claim is completely contradictory to the the law of sea, just based on some sort of we say such a maritime entitlement to the neighboring countries. No, I don't think so. So then we also needed to have a further discussion on how all such things all the different claims could just accommodate it. But the problems, China just insists that the 9-line claimed or 9-line based some sort of a China's claim should be respected and also should be just taken into account. But the problem is we also see such a dispute is still very persistent. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, probably in the eyes of the some claimant state, the China's claim over the South China Sea is very, is not conscientious. But I have to say China's claim is not acquisitive. So then we need to still just launch off some sort of such a discussion and the diplomatic, exploration to clarify some sort of different claims. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhu Feng. Now, the other issue I think is a matter of concern is what happened now in the tension between China and Philippines over the Ren Ai Jiao. And of late, there have been this trilateral summit between US, Philippines, and Japan, and earlier on the Camp David summit between Japan, US, and Korea. It appears that US is getting more and more involved, and well, some say trying to trying to duplicate a sort of Asia-Pacific NATO. Is forming united front, under this Indo-strategy. Professor Zakaria, would you like to comment something on that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I just want to go back to the issue of the South China Sea and who it belongs to. I don't think the 9-dash line is fiction or propaganda. I think we've seen it on maps produced by China itself, and they say this is the 9-dash line and this is what the territory of China is. There is quite clearly, there are disputes between the other claimants and what China claims to be its waters. So now, the two things there, one is territorial possession and the other one is on sovereignty. So, the dispute with the Philippines and China, right, is clearly about what part of that China Sea belongs to Philippines and what belongs to China. That's what we have. This is the reality. Now, we like to believe that China is a forward-looking, benign country. If it is, right, then I think we can find a way out of this problem. If China says that it wants to do development, joint development and all that, then that's fine. But we're not seeing that. Yet we see what we have is provocations. Malaysia has been very, in a way, quite reticent about many of the so-called violations of Malaysia's territorial space by Chinese ships. And more recently, there was even almost a provocation in the airspace with Chinese military aircraft coming to Malaysia's borders, what Malaysia thinks is its borders. What does those portend? I mean, this is what we have. So I think what Chandra wants to do, I think that's what we should do. First of all, the code of conduct. I think that's what we need, because code of conduct is, in a way, is a conflict management mechanism. We don't want any conflict to arise or what the disputes are. And the fact that we have not been able to get it indicates that there is some big problem that we face. There is no, shall we say, agreement that we can reach on the code of conduct. That's number one. Number two is, how do you solve this problem? You either you either leave it alone, right? Give it status quo, or there is a conflict that takes place. That is why we see the United States as playing a role, because if China is going to be belligerent, then we need to deal with it. How do we deal with it? Because the countries of South Asia are small compared to China. That's what we have to deal with. So I think, yes, we will have more debates. In fact, the problem with these discussions we have, there's been actually thousands of discussions on the South China Sea issue, by various bodies all around the world. we have not been able to come up with some kind of solution. And so, yes, I think maybe this is an avenue because we put something on the proposal on the table that we think, joint development, this code of conduct, and the other one is dealing with the so-called neutralization. In other words, we should find a way in which we can find the peaceful resolution of the territorial dispute. This is what we need. So I think that if China were to play, China is a wonderful country in a way. I'll put it this way, because it puts forward for the BRI. It wants to have infrastructure development in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. So China can do more, I think, in my mind. There was a point just now where China, when it deals with the Southeast Asian claimant countries, they deal it on a bilateral basis. And I think there's a diplomatic strategy on the part of China why they do that. But if the countries of Southeast Asia were united, then we might see a very different way in which we are approaching this problem. So my thoughts are quite simple. I mean, I think we can find a way out, but I also see they are the intangibles that we're dealing with. And the bottom part of it is, what is China's earnest desire in terms of the South China Sea? I mean, do they want to pursue in which we can have this affinity that will exist and then we can work together? I think this is what we need to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so Professor Shin, let me jump in. So one more word I want to add it. I see, yes, Dr. Zakaria mentioned China's 9-line claim is efficient. To be honest, no, it's not. We also have a historical archive to prove the legitimacy. Then if you just examine the Americans in the archive, just after back to the 1946, the Nanjing government joined the 11-line. It also got the totally approval from the United States. So then that's why I think it's some sort of baseline we should still stand very firmly on. So don't just say China's 9-line is a fiction. We can't totally take that for granted. So then, as I mentioned, some sort of reasoning thinking should be broadly shared between China and ASEAN. Thank you.
Professor Zhu Feng, let me ask you a very simple, straightforward question. Does China claim that everything within the 9-line belongs to China?
No, I disagree.
So
I don't
that's
think
very misleading when you say, I mean, outside people would think that, when you say, oh, the 9-line, our territory rights claims, is anything within the 9-line belongs to us. People would think this way. So I think it's important for China to convey its message properly and not be distorted by the Western narrative. I think it's very important. And I also believe that it's important that well, you have historical rights, but then in the modern time, well, there's these UNCLOs. So, well, there should be some kind of understanding and compromise that we can, well, Dr. Mahde, has been repeating saying over the last 2,000 years, China never invaded any ASEAN countries, never. So, yeah, so it's unlikely that it's going to invade any of these ASEAN countries, in the 21st century. However, well, China has this problem of telling the world the true fact because the mainstream media is dominated by the West. So I think it's important, and I can understand people's concern because I being a Malaysian, if I wake up and I see, Chinese vessel is just, not very far away, of course I don't feel comfortable. And that's all human being, right? Yeah, so I think it is important that we sort things out. I mean, to be fair, right? So anyway, so let's proceed to any other, yeah, okay, Dr. Chandra, yeah.
Moderator, Mr. Koh, I think this discussion on the South China Sea has perhaps opened a new avenue for us to approach the same issue from a slightly different angle. One of our speakers had said that the Chinese perspective on the South China Sea is inclusive, not exclusive. Am I right? Remember, this was said in the first session, that it is inclusive. Now, if it is inclusive, then I think China has to demonstrate that it is inclusive and not exclusive. Because the impression that we have got so far from all the discussions and discourses is that China has got an exclusive notion of the South China Sea. And that is a very, very important issue to clarify. If it is not exclusive, and if you're sincere and you say it is inclusive, then I think let's demonstrate this, that's inclusive, meaning by which we have to try to integrate the underlying principles of UNCLOS, notions of territorial rights and all the rest of it into this discussion. And we can then work out some sort of code of conduct. And it also brings me to this other point that's raised by my colleague Hassan, that there is a trust deficit. And maybe one way of overcoming the trust deficit is by addressing the South China Sea issue and saying on the South China Sea, we understand the sentiments and the feelings of the other states. And let me just elaborate on this very quickly. You know, China has had a certain relationship with the South China Sea, partly because of its maintenance of historical records. But then if you look at the South China Sea from another angle, don't forget that many of the islands, many of the nation states today that are part of this region have had a long history of maritime encounters. They know these seas well, they've been part of it, they have traversed the whole area, but they did not have the same sort of attitude towards the maintenance of historical records. They did not name places. And this is something very important. Just because they didn't name places, it doesn't mean that they don't have rights. So if you're prepared to take that into account, and this is something we're addressing directly to China through civil society groups and intellectuals like you, show that you are capable of understanding this, that the Southeast Asian nations, the maritime states, have had a long, long history too, and a long relationship with these waters, and they have memories. And these must be taken into account. This is so very important. China is such a big nation. If she can show that she's big-hearted as far as this is concerned, genuinely big-hearted, open, prepared to accommodate other interests, prepared to talk, prepared to take into account various other dimensions of this issue linked to UNCLOS and territory and all the rest of it today in the modern era, if they're prepared to do that, then I think the trust that we're talking about, this trust deficit, may be overcome to some extent. Let me say this in conclusion, the last line, Koh King Kee, that I see the South China Sea issue, however you may want to look at it, I see this as an issue on which China may lose out to the United States on this issue. And they will lose out in the sense that eventually Southeast Asian nation states who are sympathetic to China, who understand China and want to try to understand China, they would be totally put off by the Chinese attitude. So there is a need for China to show a more accommodative and understanding approach is required from China as far as this issue is concerned. Thank you.
Yes, Doctor, yes, I agree with you that there's a need to improve, to enhance the political trust between China and ASEAN. I think that's important. And partly because of the US involvement, but China view US as an external power in the South China Sea issue. So This is why it become complicated, become an international issue. So anyone from the China side, Chinese speakers who would like to respond to Dr. Chandra's comment? Captain Zhu Tongfei, Professor Zhu Tongfei, Professor Zhong Tenfei.
Yeah, actually, I several points on this topic. The first one, I also want to re-emphasize Dr. Tian's claims about Chinese government's position on this issue. Chinese government has officially never claimed the whole water in the 9 dash line. So that may be the U.S. story telling about China claims the whole water or 80% or 90%. Chinese never claimed that since. What the Chinese government want to emphasize is the islands in this kind of 9 dash line belongs to China. But what the near water or the adjacent water, the scale Chinese government in his law, I think released in 1996, make it very clearly. It's through negotiation with a bilateral way with the claims in Southeast Asia to divide it clearly which kind of what should be belong to China. So that is the very important point I want to emphasize. It's not the whole water, it's the sovereign, China's sovereign right on this issue. And the second point I want to emphasize is, since the earlier 1970s, when China became a member of the United Nations, replaced Republic of China in that time. President Nixon visited China in 1970s, early 1970s. In that time, we never heard from the U.S. side about the dispute in South China Sea. And even I think in early 1990s, at the end of Cold War and the end of the negotiation of the UN clause in 1994, I think in that time, just as Mr. Koh mentioned, U.S. policy in that time much more neutral than now, I think, in 1995. So the reason why U.S. put so much emphasis on South China Sea, just like I mentioned, as they see China as a challenge in this region, and so the United States does want to link South China Sea issue as China's threat. Let the neighboring countries accept their claims about China's threat. That is the second point, I think. The third point is since the late 1970s, when People's Republic of China replaced Republic of China in UN, Chinese government sent a lawyer to participate in the negotiation of the UN about the law, maritime law. So China is a part of this evolving process of maritime law since 1970s. But you can see very clearly the Senate of the United States never agree with the government of the United States to sign this agreement. So we can make clearly which country in this issue area are partner of this international law in terms of maritime issue. And the last point I want to emphasize, the issue is very important. I agree with the point mentioned by Professor Zhu. To Chinese government, when Chinese government learned to the multilateralism in international stage, in my view, is from Asia. In the early 1990s, the end of the war, surrounding the countries surrounding China, Northeast is the South Korea, North Korea, we did not establish a formal diplomatic relation with South Korea until 1992, and Central Asia country just divorced from Soviet Union. They are in the process of national building. So only in Southeast Asia countries, they are in the poverty in this region, and they are more experienced, more accumulate more experience, I think, in multilateral way to deal with outside world. So in the early 1990s, when the Vice Prime Minister Chen also Minister of Foreign Affairs in Chinese government, was invited to attend the ARF initiated by Asian countries. So since that time, China learned that multilateralism is very important to formulate Chinese foreign policy and help Chinese to remaking its new emerge as a responsible power in this region. So to Chinese, we learned from Asia that Asia not only as an institution, but also as a normative power in this region, just like European Union, a normative power in this region. So to Chinese government, we respect for Asia's role in region to help stabilize this region and to promote a cooperative way in this region. So in my view, Asia can play important role to stabilize region, also to persuade the Philippines sit down to help coordinate a negotiation with members of Asia or Chinese side. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhong. Yeah, Mr. Hasana, you have any comments? Before we end,
but nothing really much, because I agree with what a lot has been said, and it's also for me not necessarily surprising per se, but to know about the inclusivity what you call it angle about the 9-9 issue. It just highlights for me about the importance of having a what do you call it a degree of participation in the narrative of the event, because we all know that when it comes to hegemonic influences from external sources like the United States, definitely narrative plays a very important role, especially when it comes to garnering US stability and relationships in the region, especially with China. I wanted to add one thing actually. Aside from the code of conduct, the ASEAN-led negotiation of the code of conduct, anyone can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I also believe that there should also be some further development on the declaration of the conduct of parties, which was initiated in 2002 as a non-binding code of conduct to manage disputes and maintain stability in the South China Sea. Perhaps something looking towards furthering a meaningful development towards the documents would actually serve as a foundation for further understanding and further or how we will approach this issue further. And the next part is, along with the narrative issue, governmental to governmental negotiations and discussions as well, it serves a very long way. But when it comes to ASEAN, I've always been under the impression that ASEAN's, what do you call it? The way ASEAN behaves has a lot to do with its non-governmental actors and its institutions as well, especially when it comes to when it comes to establishing a particular narrative and a particular way of viewing things. So I also suggest that perhaps looking at facilitating of more track 2 diplomacies in ASEAN as well, like involving more non-governmental actors, and to explore solutions to build consensus in the South China Sea will be a great approach, because the narrative is a very important part, especially since, you know, a lot of what you've mentioned, like Koh King Kee, you mentioned a lot of the Western media has dominated the narrative for a very long time, especially in popular discourse, in regards to how we view things like, what do you call it? The way that we understand the whole South China Sea issue, especially from our point of view as well. And I feel like there needs to be a lot more open-hearted engagement, like Dr. Chandra said as well, in regards to the way that China needs to deal with the Southeast Asian neighbors. I do want to emphasize one thing, of course, which is, like Dr. Chandra said, if it's not handled well, there is a chance that China could lose this narrative, essentially this narrative battle to the US as well. And I also wanted to put my opinion across on this one, where I think there's also a time limit factor. And the US also, from how I looked at their analysis, they also are aware that there is a urgency when it comes to this. That's why they've pushed for more strategic militarization, is pushed for more active involvement, not shying away anymore. Like I said, turning from tactical to strategy. Because with that emphasis in mind, there is a lot more need for China to urgently develop its standing and its relationships with Southeast Asia, because the US is definitely trying to build up pressure fast, because they know that as far, I believe, as far as when it comes to its militarization capacity, China is catching up. China is definitely on its almost, you can say, it's equal footing on how fast it has been developing, and they know that they have a time scale issue, so they're trying to ramp it up. And I think this is where China could also meet this challenge head on by advocating for essentially developing much stronger regional ties with Southeast Asia. And I'll end on that note. And yeah, so again, thank you, Koh King Kee.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan, because we are running short of time. Before I invite the co-host to make a concluding remark, I'd like to invite Dr. Jin. You have anything to say?
Yeah. Okay, sure. Of course. I just want to make a quick comment or response to Dr. Chandra. He actually warned. May I use the terminology warning? He warned us that China may lose in the game in the long run. But I may respond from a different perspective. I think we should not overestimate, nor should we underestimate the role of the U.S. and its capability to influence or interfere. In my personal view, I think although the United States is not a direct claimant in the South China Sea dispute or issue, it has various strategic and policy resources and capabilities and intentions and determinations to impose substantial influence in the region in one way or another. So I think at the strategic and geopolitical level, the South China Sea issue is a matter between China and the United States. At a practical level, it is an issue between China and other direct claimants in Southeast Asia. So it seems to me the South China Sea issue resembles a two-tier structure. As long as this two-tier structure exists, I think resolving this South China Sea issue will be a very long and exhausting wrestling. It even reminds me of the three-body problem. So this is my quick comment and response.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jin. Yeah, now I would like to invite our co-host Captain Tian to make a concluding remark. Because I know that you are in a rush for another appointment.
Thank you, Kiki. Thank you for all the speakers and the moderators for your facilitation and for your contribution. Although I'm in a hurry to leave, still I want to make a few points. First, in responding to some points you have mentioned for Kiki and also for Professor Hana. So I think it's not whether China conveys the message clear or not. It's just because the narrative war or disinformation come by the United States. They just turn a blind eye to the clear information Chinese government has conveyed, because we do not hold the speakers of international media. So whatever we say, they cannot be conveyed to the public international opinions. So that's the reason why you have a role to play to help China to convey the correct message to the international world. I think we would thank you a lot if you could help China to not to intentionally one word, but only to convey our message clearly. And And second, still, I would like to say I like the beauty of the joint development resolution, joint development zones. I mean, I have clarified the Chinese official government, but even we claim the whole China Sea, but still, the main point of the joint development is that let's put aside whatever your claim, then joint development. So it has nothing to do with the exact claimant, exact position of each claimant. So for this point, still I do not understand why some ASEAN countries are not active with the idea of joint development, but still I like the beauty of the joint development resolution. I'm an international lawyer. I have studied many international best practice in this regard. So still, I think this is a direction for all countries in this region to pursue. And also very earnestly, Dr. Dato asked what exactly China wants in the South China Sea. I think it's also very simple and clear. China wants peace and stability in the South China Sea. Still, to make the Chinese people in mainland to develop our country is still the priority of Chinese government. We want to make our people to live happily. We want to raise our living standards. So that's still the priority of Chinese government. To achieve this priority, we want to achieve peace and stability in the South China Sea. So earnestly speaking, that is exactly what we want in the South China Sea. So if you listen to the disinformation by the United States to describe China as a kind of big country bullying the small countries, actually, if you look at the history of Chinese military, we originated from a land army. So still, the Chinese armed forces is called the People's Liberation Army. Even I'm from the Navy, but we are PLA Navy. So actually, we are strong, quite strong in army. We are quite experienced in fighting a land warfare. So we have many experience in the Korean War, in the Liberation War, in the anti-Japanese war. So if you apply the logic to China's case, I think we would have used this strengths to expand in the land aspect of our boundary. But actually, we signed with peace agreements. We signed using the peace agreement with the 12 of the 14 of our land neighbors. We did not use the advantage of our land military power. So I think that's one point I would like to emphasize. And also, I think that the point is, as I mentioned in many discussions, the United States is trying to set up a security trap in the Asia-Pacific, which means that they try to politicize every single point between the bilateral relations to overstretch the national security concerns, to relating every normal trade relations or cultural relations, cultural exchanges, all of other relations to national security, so that many countries in this region can buy the ideas to invest more on the military side, to invest more on security side. I think the consequence will be negative. We lose the opportunity of developing ourselves. So I think the peace and the prosperity of this region is at our own hands. I think we must keep this very clear. The peace and stability is the common interest of all the countries in this region, and also is in the interest of international community. So I think the peace and stability, the prosperity is at our hands. We need more discussions to pursue a positive resolution to the South China Sea issue. With that, I'd like to conclude my remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Captain Tian. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Chandra to say the last few words before we wrap up today's session. Dr. Chandra.
Thank you very much, Koh King Kee. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. And on behalf of the International Movement for a Just World, we are most grateful to all of you for your ideas, for the time and energy that you have put into this webinar. And we hope it will be the beginning of other similar endeavors. We have very big challenges ahead. Just one of them was, of course, the South China Sea issue that came to the fore as expected. But I think there's a lot more that we can discuss. Let me, for instance, highlight something which I know is important to China and is important for the whole region, which has not been brought into the discussion about the South China Sea. And it is this very critical point. If China is very concerned about the South China Sea and how it is defined and how it is seen, it's partly because if you look at China's economic development, South and Southeast China, where you have a lot of your manufacturing, a lot of your factories, which have become very important areas in the transformation of China's economy, they face the South China Sea. In other words, how the South China Sea is seen and how it is perceived in the coming decades is going to be very, very important in terms of China's own development, because of where your development is and why that is critical to the transformation of China. Now, I think as a Southeast Asian, as someone from ASEAN, I understand that. For the same reason, I think China should show some understanding now of how Southeast Asian nations feel about the South China Sea. Leave aside the United States of America, what its own interests are and what its own perspectives are, that's something else. But if you look at just the countries in this region, whether it's Vietnam or the Philippines or a country like Malaysia, and of late we have seen Indonesia also expressing a position on these maritime issues, even though they are not part of the South China Sea issue. Nonetheless, Indonesia is also very concerned. So Southeast Asian countries, the countries in ASEAN, they have a perspective, they have a view about this whole thing. And I don't think China has given enough cognizance to the positions adopted by the South Asian countries. China has seen this issue of South China Sea and certain other issues largely through its perspective in relation to the United States of America. But I think that's not enough. The US is a major actor, but let us see it through our own perspectives as nations that belong to this region. And in the case of Southeast Asia and its interaction with China, we share history and we share geography. We have to develop better understanding of each other. And I'm really hoping that on this important issue, starting with civil society and your intellectual community, the official Chinese position on the South China Sea and ASEAN will manifest a greater level of understanding and comprehension of how your neighbors feel and what your neighbors think. Let us develop that sort of neighborliness amongst ourselves. Trust. Trust is the most important thing in any neighborly relationship. Don't forget, if I may conclude on this line, Brother Koh King Kee, that if you look at the question of ASEAN, the South China Sea, and China, in terms of the larger geopolitics that confronted us, let us not forget that just as Eastern Europe and Central Asia had always been important to Russia, just as Latin America is critical to the United States of America, Southeast Asia is going to be a defining factor in terms of China's rise and China's role, because we are your neighbor. We are your neighbor, and that counts a great deal, as it has in the case of other big powers and superpowers in history. So let us try to overcome this problem. And I think the time has come, because it has dragged on for so long, this issue. The time has come for us to be honest with one another tell the truth, and come to a deeper understanding, which would show magnanimity on your part, on the part of China, and understanding on the part of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chandra, for your very insightful summary of the South China Sea issue. I totally agree that there must be enhanced political trust. You know, the political trust between China and ASEAN need to enhance, need to improve through more interaction and engagement, not just on the G2G level, but also I think the scholars, the academic, you know, the Chinese saying of 民心相通. This is very important. You know, people to people bond, people to people understanding. So it is very important that we should have more track too. You know,
Yes.
activity. These events like this one. This is you know, a good example, and this is why we feel that it's important, and is there's an urgency actually on this South China Sea that no one should overlook. And we are able to enjoy the economic growth, you know, over the last 40 years is because of peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity in this part of the world, as Captain Tian said, security and peace is very important. It is a precondition for growth. So I think we should treasure that, and we should not allow, you know, people who have other geopolitical interests, you know, to interfere and to destroy, to damage the peace and security we enjoy. And I like to thank the speakers, you know, from China, from Malaysia, for taking time to share their insights and perspective. They are very valuable comments, and I hope, you know, the voices, you know, will be heard by the relevant parties, and we hope we can have more such activities in future. And I also like to thank the participants, you know, and this the proceedings of the this webinar will be posted in YouTube so that it will be shared by so that other people who have no time or opportunity to participate online will be able to watch the proceedings. With that, again, I would like to thank everyone for making this webinar a success, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.